Hello, everybody. Welcome to this talk. It's called Synthetic Biocrusts. My name is Paula Meijerink. We are both associated with the Ohio State University at the Knowlton School.
And my name is Teichman. So today we're going to start by talking about some of the pedagogical foundations for this research-driven studio course that we just taught. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this topic of biocrust. What is it? And why does it matter for designers and design students? We'll go over the course structure and show some examples of student outcomes. And then we will share some takeaways that we learned from this and then we want to share for others who might be thinking about innovative pedagogy.
So the studio is about biocrusts, and that is a topic that not many people know about and very few people talk about. So we've brought this in the context of the studio. We'll talk about what it is more later.
And we're very excited about it just because it's this really beautiful and also ecologically important material that often is ignored and really helps to connect between different ways of working disciplinarily. So we thought it was a perfect conduit.
This studio is in a land-grant university, and that means that a lot of our students were born in Ohio. So this studio is about expanding their learning opportunities, right? And therefore, we have taken them to Utah, and we're really researching another part of the country. Bloom's taxonomy, fundamental to many of the educations in the United States, leads to the creative process and innovation through a series of, through a process. Kolb's experiential learning theory brings external influences inside the learning process, which leads to iteration and adaptation, therefore related to entanglements, which is important in this talk and in the studio.
Similarly, Joan Iverson-Nassauer has recently advocated for the necessity of transdisciplinary and boundary crossing work in landscape architecture, scholarship, and education, with a focus on working between scientific and artistic approaches and moving from a disciplinary framework or a multidisciplinary framework to expand to work across and between disciplines, so transdisciplinarily. We have been excited by approaches like Rosetta Elkin's tiny taxonomy, which focuses on attention to tiny landscapes and the entanglements therein, and Mary Pat McGuire's innovative and kind of critical approach to surfaces as dynamic and as essential to as a medium for operations for design that can take on really a lot of capacity and performance, even if it's very thin and seems like a superficial landscape.
So what is biocrust, right? And biocrust is formed by cyanobacteria that hold the mineral particles together, lichen, fungi, bryophytes, and microfauna. We'll find dry, and they are in dry lands, in desert-like environments, which takes on 45% of the Earth's landmass. 12% of that is biocrust. So it's actually really interesting to see that few people know about it, while it takes on such a large part of the environment, including 70% of the Colorado Plateau, where we are working. Students were taking them to Canyonlands and to the Moab, larger Moab area, because there is a research center there, right?
Which
we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
So the course was structured in 4 projects, and in the middle of that, we had this field trip, which we mentioned, to southeastern Utah to learn on site. A big focus was, as we mentioned, this approach of thinness as kind of a design inquiry tool that can work between science and art approaches and can be a boundary condition that negotiates between them. We kind of assessed a variety of learning objectives, moving from expanding a design vocabulary to think about entanglement and complexity, to have students learn to communicate across and between disciplines, as well as focusing on hands-on learning by making, and learning by field work in a variety of contexts.
So project one deals with art, and we asked students to create really thin layers leading to a transformed panel through addition and wearing away surfaces, starting from small to larger panels. And so here you see some samples of the final outcome. We also asked students to develop a script, really precise, moment by moment articulation of their process. And so this panel is created by adding and subtracting layers, adding paper, subtracting through the table saw, sorry. Project two, Communicating Across, is science-based. Through lectures by external specialists and workshops, this led to a series of models and drawings through which students explain what a biocrust is. We ask them to illustrate scientific knowledge that they found through a number of journals that they studied and express that through models. So you can see that here, a kit of parts where people can assemble their own biocrust, or a series of panels that explain the different components, or through a Mr. Potato Head method, assembling also a biocrust. This student Ethan worked with Hugo, who developed an animated drawing indicating how heavy metals leach into the ground and affect the biocrust.
So in teams of two, students were both asked to collectively make both a model, a physical interactive model, and an animated drawing. So each team of two made both of those.
And while the previous project was an animated section, this is an animated plan. So here you can see the cyanobacteria. These are the little lines that hold the soil particles together. These little critters that move across this landscape. And then finally, the mosses or bryophytes that start to occupy or colonize this space.
And students had no animation experience before the studio, so we were impressed to see what some of them were able to do. So the third project happened on the field trip, which is in Southeast Utah, and between Canyonlands and Arches, as well as adjacent to and next in the Bears Ears National Monument, an important landscape for Native Americans, as well as a fairly contested landscape. Which is also the location of the Canyonlands Research Center, which is a research center on dryland ecosystems, rainless-land ecologies, and especially biocrust. And here we see one of their big focuses is biocrust restoration. And so this is a biocrust restoration plot they have there, as well as biocrust adaptations to climate change, which is where we see students witnessing a test plot and learning from scientists on site there. And so from this, students were asked to learn by observing closely and through drawing, and learning across scales. So thinking about large scale systems, and observing those, as well as learning about small scale systems through close observation and understanding the connections between and across those scales of systems. And so the final project, the fourth project, was focused on designing a biocrust garden, um, which asked students to kind of synthesize everything they had learned and the different approaches they had encountered and ways of thinking into a designed landscape, which focused on experience, ecology, and education as a dimension of a landscape encounter. So some students focused on a spatial design and creating kind of a sculptural or a sacred landscape, which engaged Biocrust to tell story or make encounter with uh, different scales or kind of a cosmological approach to thinking about Biocrust and landscape, while others focused on the kind of climatological and the ways these landscapes can change in the wet or dry season. And the students were asked to think through designing processes. So some of them engaged dust and the accumulation of dust as a formation of landscape, others thinking about freeze and thaw cycles and ways of articulating those. And the role that they play using biocrust as a medium, and others thought about how even a concrete surface can accumulate and grow biocrust. And so all students were asked to make animations that show processes or kind of ephemeral moments happening across time. So here we see spores landing on these concrete pads and starting to grow and assemble into biocrust.
So how can we talk about this studio and the work that we've been doing in the context of pedagogy? And how can we talk about it as takeaways, or as what do we learn from this, and how could we share that with you? So the first point is really about complexity, right? Biocrust, by researching biocrust from a scientific and artistic an engagement perspective, allowed us to really think about it and deal with complexity, right? So that was really, really phenomenal.
Likewise, students became experts at transdisciplinary thinking and storytelling between and across disciplines by working with science and science literacy, as well as scientists, and working with art literacy, and artists, thinking about experience as a bridge. So students were communicating with different stakeholders, with experts in different fields, speaking different languages. But what really kind of they pulled their kind of artistic eye developed in the earlier projects into ways of communicating kind of their scientific findings and the papers that the scientists were working on, and how that could kind of be experienced. And so experience became a really big part of that storytelling, thinking about how students as designers can shape ways of interacting, and then those modes of interaction can tell a story and can shape the way people understand this. And so the students really became experts in this topic. They had an ownership of the knowledge. They were given time and independence to focus and hone their creative skills, their aesthetic and ethical sensibilities, and their expertise and their literacy with these different ways of working. They worked with stakeholders that often they don't get to work with scientists and with land managers. And they also became ecological advocates. So these students, had a really deep knowledge, and they also felt motivated to care about something that many of them had never thought about, but which is very important to ecosystems, and they all felt and were passionate to communicate this to others. And so students became not just better designers, but we really saw this as a way of using design education to empower students as ecological citizens and ecological advocates in their careers.
And I think the idea of taking ownership of knowledge in an undergraduate program is really fundamental, and it's really important. And I think we really achieved that in this project. And maybe also that landscape architects, you're not really isolated in the field, right? You really work with others. So what we brought to the studio is really a way, broadening their perspective and a new way of thinking by collaborating and interacting with other disciplines. So that was great. Thank you very much for your attention. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You'll find our contact information here. And we hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.